Welcome back to OpenLine, talking about the Tennessee State Legislature. It's in session. We're about halfway through. All kinds of bills are floating around the legislature. We're talking about some of them. Some are, well, they're almost all very interesting. Some may have a better chance of passing than others. We have with us from the Tennessean, Joel Ebert, who is the reporter up there at the legislature, and several calls. We've already had some interesting calls already. Let's go back to the phones. Phyllis. Hello, Phyllis.
Hello, thank you for taking my call.
Yes, ma'am.
I've been thinking about this for years. Why hasn't anyone addressed the issue about how far along are you when you decide you cannot afford to or take care of the baby that you're going to have? I believe you should do that right. You should do it right away. And if you wait any longer, if you wait any longer than 3 weeks or something, then it's too bad. You should just, have the child. And
so you're saying there should be a minimum period at which, after a certain period of time, you cannot have an abortion.
Right, because I've walked into abortion clinics and seen people using it like birth control, and I think it's sad. I think somebody should say, okay, let's write this down, and if you're 3 weeks, 4 weeks tops pregnant, then yes, you can get help getting an abortion.
I thought there were some guidelines. I don't think it's 3 or 4 weeks. In fact, I'm sure it's not. But are you aware of...
I'm not familiar with Tennessee's laws, but last year I covered the West Virginia legislature, and they had a bill that was a 20-week abortion ban. I think there are a lot of states that have that, where it's around that 20, 21, 22-week abortion bans.
Okay, and do we have a 48-hour waiting period?
We do, yes.
So Tennessee does have a 48-hour waiting period. All right, some other bills that are coming up on a totally different note. Online sports betting. Okay, so other states are taking a stance on this.
Yeah.
And we're talking fantasy football, right? That's one of the big things.
Right.
Fantasy football. A lot of people do that. Some states are saying that is gambling, that is wrong.
Right.
Where is Tennessee on this?
Essentially, we're leaning more towards the let's regulate the industry effort. There isn't necessarily an indication of whether they're going to continue down that path. Today was the first day that the issue really came up in the legislature, and so far lawmakers on one committee said, we don't want to ban it. This is too much of a popular industry, so we might as well regulate it. The bill that was brought forward came from these groups like, I believe they're called FanDuel is one, and DraftKings.
Right.
And they're proud of the fact that actually today in Virginia, that legislature approved a bill that essentially would be the same thing. It was the first state in the country to say we're going to have regulation on the industry.
So by regulation, it means we're going to legalize it. We're going to let it happen.
Yes, yes.
So some people might think, oh, right, but if you're for it, then you want it to be regulated because that's like saying it's okay.
Right. And there's been some discussion of if we're going to regulate it, we should receive some sort of proceeds from it.
Tax.
That didn't occur in Tennessee. There was no discussion on that element today, but that might come along the way as that bill makes its way through the process.
Other states, and I don't know if you know this, New York,
Illinois, another one.
Did they ban it?
Yeah.
So they say not acceptable.
They've essentially said this is gambling,
right.
That we don't want to do it because this is another form of gambling, and that there are issues that arise out of that, and so they think that they can challenge us in the court system and say we're not going to allow this.
So again, and I don't know if you know this, but if you have this hodgepodge of laws across the country, where one state says it's okay, one state says it's not. Does this just mean that their headquarters would have to be in one of the states that legalizes it, or can they? What if you're participating in this in New York or Illinois, states where it's banned? I don't believe it's just the headquarters, but I'm not positive. I think it's essentially saying the residents of that state can't partake in this. Yeah, that's very interesting. All right, something that got a lot of attention: Department of Correction.
Yep.
Certainly, I guess before the legislative session started, there was a great deal of concern about the hours that correction officers worked, the number of assaults in prisons, and what was going on in our prisons. What sort of legislation are we seeing there?
We've heard a lot of talk about it. In the beginning part of the session, there were several Democrats who met and said, you know, we need to make some reform efforts. Republicans have also been behind some of these efforts, but essentially there was one bill today in particular that was trying to change the work cycle. It right now is a 28-day work cycle, and they wanted to eliminate that. That was a recently implemented plan. They
made it harder to get overtime, right?
Yeah, correct. Basically, you know, the criticism was that this really provides an uncertain time period of when they're going to have their regular schedule. So if somebody who's making $25,000 a year is trying to get an education and they don't have a regular schedule, how can they do that? But ultimately, that effort failed today in a committee. So it doesn't seem that that issue is going to be solved this year, at least.
What about privatization?
There's been talk of privatization efforts. You know, one of the ideas that came up along the way was the idea of privatizing who was going to do security for the Capitol. That's something that hasn't really made any effort. There hasn't been a change on that. But there have been some things that they've talked about privatizing. There hasn't been any major legislation that says we are going to privatize this particular aspect of state government, though.
The governor has been looking at privatizing state parks and several of those things. Now, I know there were no bids placed on the state parks.
Right.
Certainly, there's a big push around UT Knoxville and privatizing things on the campus there. And it's gotten some pushback.
Right.
There are people that are very concerned about this. The governor says we need to consider it, save money, we need to look into this. Others say this is taking us down a dangerous road.
Well, and I think, you know, the opponents of privatization are pointing to the TN Ready, the test that basically was given to a private company and said, okay, we're going to roll out the online test. And this year, the first time that they tried to do it, it actually ended up failing the day they were supposed to take the test. So the opponents of privatization say this is what happens when you take out government and give a private company a massive contract and we can't do anything about it now. We're left with the aftermath of that. But, you know, proponents still say, you know, that was one failure, and that doesn't mean that privatization in all circumstances is wrong.
Right. And then education in general. What are some of the big bills that we're seeing around that topic? You certainly talk about Tennessee Ready.
Right.
What is it? TN Ready.
TN Ready, yeah.
TN Ready, and that was a disaster.
Right.
It's hard to say it was anything but that. But as far as other education bills, what are we seeing? There's
been some stuff that is talking about religion in schools, that there's also been some effort to really push back particular pieces of legislation that would essentially they're sort of post-Common Core pieces of legislation. There's been some effort to really provide more access to local schools to have oversight of, or local boards to have more oversight of their actual education process. That's something that, you know, we haven't really seen too much pass through committee in terms of education that has been monumental change. But I think as the process goes, as the legislature continues, we're going to see some things within the higher education, but also K through 12 system change.
All right, I want to take a break. I want to come back and talk about the dynamic that's up there now. It's obviously so dominated by one party.
Right.
And what does that mean? How does that play out? All right, so we'll take a break. If you want to call, there's a number 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Be back right after this.